I was sleeping on a bench in Washington Square Park, covered by a tattered wool coat and the silence reserved for men who have been forgotten, not by accident, but by design, as if time itself had decided they no longer belonged. It was the fall of 1992, and New York had just begun to breathe in a new rhythm after decades shadowed by paranoia, red lists, and Cold War chess games that never made headlines but claimed lives in ways no obituary ever captured. Around me, students laughed on their way to class. Couples argued in whispers by the fountain, and musicians played jazz like a distraction from the wounds the city never quite treated. But I, just another old man with weathered hands and eyes too tired to look anyone in the face, remained unseen. I'd become a piece of the city's static, drifting from bench to bench, shelter to shelter, carrying only what could not be stolen. The memories of missions no one admitted happened, and the coat I refused to give up, not because it kept me warm, but because sewn into its lining, near the heart, hidden beneath years of wear and the residue of unspoken regrets, was a small metal insignia. It had no clear symbol, no name, just a number and the silhouette of an eagle wrapped in a circle, an emblem of a unit that officially never existed, one we were taught never to speak of, not even to each other. Each morning, the city woke before I did. I'd hear the rattle of trash cans, the scratch of broom bristles on pavement, and feel the dull ache in my joints before I opened my eyes. But that morning, cold, damp, and stained with golden leaves, began differently. I opened my eyes to a small voice. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, wearing a backpack too big for his shoulders and curiosity that hadn't yet been taught fear, was standing in front of me holding something in his hand. "Sir, is this yours?" he asked, holding up the insignia that must have slipped from my coat during the night, exposed by time and wear. And in that moment, faster than a shot fired in the dark, my breath caught in my throat, and my entire body seemed to stiffen. Not from the cold, but from recognition, from the sudden, visceral reminder of who I had once been and what I had once promised. That insignia was more than metal. It was memory, it was betrayal, it was identity. And seeing it again in the hands of a child who had no idea what it meant was like being dragged backward through a tunnel of time, lined with names I had forgotten for my own safety and faces I had loved in silence. If this story moved you the way it moved me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing real stories that inspire, stir the heart, and stay with you. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. I was barely 20 when I got the letter, not the kind you'd frame or show your mother, but one with no return address, no emblem, no explanation beyond a date and a location. It wasn't the official draft. I had already done my time in basic, passed unnoticed, as I'd always done. But this was different. They called it special civil intelligence, though I would come to learn that what we really were had no name at all. They told us we were patriots. They told us we were essential, but we never signed anything with our real names, and the missions we carried out never existed on paper. We were trained in a small, fenced-off compound in the Rockies, somewhere in Colorado, though no one ever said exactly where. The air smelled of pine, of gunpowder, of coffee gone stale. I remember the instructors' voices, low, precise, impersonal. Observe, record, disappear. That was the doctrine. We weren't soldiers. We weren't spies. We were something in between. I learned to walk without sound, to mimic accents, to vanish into small towns where no one asked questions and everyone knew everyone, except me. They called us ghosts, not officially, just among ourselves. And like ghosts, we had no presence in records, no home base, no uniforms, just long coats and hollow names. Our insignia, if you could call it that, was a cold metal disc, etched with an eagle whose wings spread beyond the circle's edge, and a 2-digit code that changed with every new assignment. It wasn't pinned to your chest. You carried it sewn inside your coat near your ribs, close enough to feel every time your heart beat. My first assignment was in Vermont, just a few miles from the Canadian border, in a town so small it didn't appear on half the maps. The mission, as they put it, was passive infiltration. There had been chatter about cross-border information leaks, whispers of anti-American literature being passed around in diners and barbershops. My job was to listen, to watch, to note patterns. No engagement, no disruption, just be present, invisible, and that's what I did. I found a room above a hardware store, paid in cash I was told not to ask about, and spent my days sitting in diners, drinking weak coffee and reading the local paper like someone waiting for a job offer that would never come. At night, I'd walk the empty streets, memorizing faces, listening through thin walls, counting how many trucks crossed the state road at night. It was there, during one of those night walks, that I first saw her, Clara. She was standing on her front porch, barefoot despite the cold, holding a steaming mug of something, maybe tea, maybe cider, and staring out into the dark like she expected it to answer her. She wasn't like the others. She didn't flinch at the sound of tires on gravel. Her eyes followed me, but not with suspicion, more like curiosity. The next day I saw her again, selling jars of preserves at the local farmer's market, her hands chapped from work, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon that matched nothing else she wore. We spoke casually at first. Weather, apples, how fast the leaves changed that year. I told her I was passing through looking for land, maybe a place to settle down. She didn't believe me. I think she knew right away that I didn't belong, but she never pushed. She just offered me a cup of cider and a place to sit when I looked too tired to stand. And somehow, despite all I'd been told, all the training that taught me to build walls with my words, I found myself returning, again and again, not for information, not for duty, but for the way her voice softened at dusk, for the way her porch light glowed like a signal in the dark. She reminded me of a life I had never lived, of family dinners and Sunday papers, of names spoken without fear. I started staying longer in the town than the mission required. I delayed my reports. I gave shorter answers to the men on the other end of the radio. When they asked why the data was slow, I blamed snow, blamed broken antennas, anything but the truth, that I was beginning to forget which part of me was real and which was the role. Clara never asked what I did, not once. But one evening, sitting on her porch, she handed me a blue handkerchief folded neatly, something passed down from her mother. "If you ever come back," she said, "bring this with you, and the thing you keep in your coat. Then I'll know it's you." She never said insignia. She didn't need to. I nodded, unable to speak. I tucked the handkerchief into my coat beside the metal disc, and in that moment I wasn't a ghost. I was a man. I was someone with a place to return to. But ghosts don't get homes. A week later, the extraction order came. Immediate, no warning, no time for goodbyes. There had been a breach. One of us had been compromised. We were told to burn everything that could trace us, including the coat if needed. I didn't. I couldn't. I ran, not because I feared death, but because I feared forgetting. I left Clara without a word, without a note, just vanished, as trained. And for decades after, I never knew if she remembered me or if I was just another shadow swallowed by the fog. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. Not with fanfare, not with music swelling like in the movies, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible pauses between breaths, in the way a person says your name without saying it out loud, in how their silence gives you permission to stay. That's how it was with Clara. What began as short conversations about apple preserves and early frosts slowly unraveled into something deeper, something I didn't have a name for back then. We never spoke of love. That word was too large, too dangerous, and we both had lived long enough to know that the moment you name something, you risk losing it. I came back to her porch night after night, not because I had orders, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't help myself. I'd watch her watering her garden in the fading light, her hands moving slowly over the basil and marigolds, her sleeves rolled up, the scent of earth and tea leaves clinging to her skin. She never asked where I went during the day, never questioned the scratches on my knuckles, or why I always seemed to flinch when someone slammed a car door. I think she knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the code names or the missions, but something in her understood the quiet exhaustion I carried, the kind of tired that no amount of sleep can fix. Some nights, we sat in silence, the two of us side by side on the porch swing, the creak of the chains the only sound between us. She'd hand me a mug of cider or tea, and we'd just exist together. No demands, no confessions. I'd study the way her hands wrapped around the mug, the way she pulled the sleeves of her sweater down over her wrists when the wind picked up. And I'd wonder if anyone had ever told her how beautiful she looked when she wasn't trying to be anything for anyone else. One evening, when the sky was the color of ash and the first leaves had begun to fall, she looked at me, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a calm kind of knowing, and said, "You don't have to say anything, but if there ever comes a day when this, whatever this is, has to end, just don't leave me with nothing." I wanted to promise her the world. I wanted to tell her I'd stay, but I couldn't. So instead, I did the only thing I could. I reached into my coat, pulled out the insignia, the cold, dark metal that had been my only constant for years, and pressed it into her hand. She held it for a long moment, her thumb running over its surface, and then nodded. "Keep this with you," she whispered, "but if you ever return, bring it back to me. That way, I'll know it's still you underneath everything." I didn't cry. Couldn't. Men like me had been trained to bury every emotion that might crack the mask. But something shifted that night, something I couldn't put back. Her words stayed with me, buried deeper than any mission debriefing, deeper even than the names of those I'd watched and followed and reported on. That handkerchief she gave me, blue, hand-stitched, frayed slightly at the corners, became my safeguard, not from harm, but from losing myself entirely. It was the one piece of color in a world that had become nothing but gray. The irony, of course, is that love, real love, is always quieter than the things we chase in its absence, and it doesn't require grand gestures, just presence, just attention. Just the willingness to sit in silence and let another person's existence shape yours. Clara taught me that without ever trying. She gave me the gift of being seen, not as an operative, not as a threat, but as a man. But men like me don't get to choose how stories end. The extraction order came 3 days later. It was a cold morning, and I'd just left her porch with the scent of rosemary still on my clothes. I walked back to the boarding room above the hardware store and found a single envelope waiting, blank, sealed with a stamp I recognized immediately. The message inside was short: compromised, burn contact, disappear. No apology, no explanation, no room for disobedience. I stared at the words for a long time, knowing exactly what they meant. I wasn't just leaving Clara, I was erasing her. I wasn't just exiting the mission, I was exiting everything that had ever made me feel like a person again. My hands trembled as I packed. I left the room clean, no traces. I didn't write a letter. I didn't knock on her door one last time. I couldn't. Because ghosts don't get to say goodbye. Ghosts don't leave footprints. I left the town before dawn, driving a borrowed car with no license plate down a road I'd memorized in silence. I looked once in the rearview mirror, just once, and told myself I'd return. I promised, not to any agency or superior, but to her, and to the part of me that still believed in the possibility of return. And for years after, through assignments in desert towns and cities that never sleep, through long nights under flickering motel signs, I carried that handkerchief, carried that promise, carried her, even when everything else had been burned. When the Cold War finally ended, not with a bang, but with headlines and handshakes and vague promises of peace, I expected that some part of me would feel relieved, maybe even redeemed. For years, we'd lived like shadows, constantly shifting, obeying commands from faceless voices, building our lives around silence and suspicion. And yet when it was all over, when the walls finally fell and the old enemies became trade partners, no one came for us. No medals, no discharge papers, no official acknowledgement that we had ever existed. Men like me, who had operated off the books for decades, were simply erased, vanished from history just as we had once been trained to vanish from sight. There was no ceremony, no back pay, no pension. We were too dangerous to be remembered, too inconvenient to be honored. I remember walking into the Veterans Affairs office in Manhattan, standing in line behind men with ribbons on their jackets and dog tags around their necks, men who had names and dates and numbers that fit into their forms. I had none of that. I gave them the name I used during missions. They looked it up, frowned, and shook their heads. "There's no record," they said. "You sure you served?" I walked out that day with nothing but the cold air in my lungs and a tightening in my chest that felt like shame, but was really something worse: emptiness. I spent the next few years drifting. I slept in shelters when they had room, under bridges when they didn't. I learned which churches had soup kitchens, which pharmacies would sell you aspirin without asking too many questions. I never begged. I still had that much pride left, but I took what I could when it came. I carried everything I owned in a duffel bag: extra socks, a flask, the handkerchief Clara gave me, and the coat. Always the coat. I couldn't let it go. It was the last piece of my identity, worn and heavy, the inside pocket still stitched tight around that insignia I had stopped looking at, but could never throw away. Sometimes I'd hear news on the radios in corner stores or bars. Politicians talking about healing, about reconciliation, about rebuilding trust between the people and the government. I'd laugh to myself. Trust? What did they know about trust? About being told you don't exist the moment your usefulness ends? About giving everything you have, your youth, your name, your soul, to a cause that won't even put a star by your name when it's over? I tried to work again. I picked up odd jobs, moved boxes in warehouses, swept floors in back alley diners, washed dishes in restaurants where no one knew my name. But something about me always felt off to people. Maybe it was the way I watched exits. Maybe it was the way I never asked questions, never talked about family, never looked anyone in the eye for too long. Whatever it was, I never stayed employed for more than a few weeks, and eventually I stopped trying. I became what the world feared: a man with no past and no future, walking streets that had forgotten him. But I never stopped carrying that insignia. I still kept it sewn into the lining of the coat, the same place it had always been, over the heart, where a name should have gone. I told myself I wasn't holding on to it for me. I told myself it was for her, that one day, if I ever found Clara again, if she was still alive, still waiting, still believing, I could show it to her, and she'd know. I wandered like that for years, faces blurred, seasons passed without notice. I watched entire city blocks change, old diners replaced by boutiques, libraries turned into condos, corner stores that once sold cigarettes now filled with yoga mats and herbal teas. The world moved on, and I stood still. Then came the morning in the fall of 1992. The leaves had just begun to turn in the city, and the air carried that early chill that slips into your bones before the sun rises. I was asleep on a bench in Washington Square Park, the same bench I'd claimed for months. The coat was pulled tight around me, the handkerchief pressed flat between the pages of a book I no longer read. And in my sleep, something must have shifted. Something must have come loose, because when I opened my eyes, the boy was there. He couldn't have been older than 10, maybe 11. His shoes were scuffed, his jacket slightly oversized, his backpack swinging at his side like a pendulum. He was holding something small in his hand, the morning light catching the edge of it. "Sir," he said, voice soft but steady, "is this yours?" And there it was, my insignia. It must have fallen out in the night. The lining of the coat had grown thin, and the stitching I once trusted had finally given way. I stared at the object in his hand, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. It was as if everything I had once been, everything I had buried, denied, forgotten, was now being held up by a child who had no idea what it meant. But he didn't run, he didn't laugh, he waited. And in his waiting something shifted. It was the first time in years someone had spoken to me like I mattered, like I was something more than what the streets had turned me into, like I was still a man. That small act, an outstretched hand, a simple question, began to unravel everything I thought I had lost. And though he didn't know it, though he couldn't possibly understand the weight of what he was giving back, that boy brought me the first piece of myself I thought was gone forever. A few days after that morning in the park, after that small, outstretched hand held out not just a lost insignia, but something closer to redemption, I saw the boy again. This time he wasn't alone. I was sitting in the same spot, watching the pigeons fight over scraps, and the sun press through the trees like it was trying to remember how to shine through the city's grey. And there he was, walking toward me across the square, holding the hand of an older woman who moved slowly, carefully, like each step cost her something. Her hair was white and coiled neatly, her coat buttoned high despite the mild weather. She didn't speak at first, she just looked at me. I recognized her before I let myself believe it. There's a kind of recognition that doesn't hit you like a memory, but like gravity, pulling everything inside you toward a single, inescapable truth. It was in her eyes. Not just their color or shape, but the way they studied me, the way they flickered between doubt and hope and something that felt like fear. She didn't ask if it was me. She said it, a whisper, so soft I might have imagined it. John, my name. Not the one I used in the files, not the one printed on forged IDs. My real name. A name I hadn't heard in decades, spoken aloud by someone who had every right to forget me. I stood up, slowly, like I wasn't sure my legs would hold. I felt the weight of the coat all over again, the weight of time, of distance, of silence. She reached out, tentative, trembling, and touched my face like she was afraid I'd vanish. It was Clara. Older, yes. Wrinkled by life, worn by years I hadn't shared with her. But it was her. Her voice had changed slightly, softer, lower. But the steadiness was still there. The way she held herself, the way she waited. She told me she had never stopped wondering. After the town emptied and she was relocated, swept away like dust under the new policies, she had tried to ask questions, but no one answered. People told her I wasn't real, that I was part of something they didn't have clearance to discuss. Some said I had never been there to begin with. She even started to doubt herself, but she never threw away the handkerchief. She kept it in a box with her mother's things, and when her grandson came home with a strange little piece of metal, cold, dark, unmarked, she knew. She didn't understand how or why or what it meant that he'd found it, but she knew. She brought him with her that day not to prove a point, but to confirm a feeling. When she saw me sitting there, bent slightly from the cold, hair thinner, beard heavier, she still knew. And somehow, so did he. He looked at me like I was a puzzle he didn't know how to solve but wanted to. We sat on the bench together like two ghosts realizing they hadn't actually died. She held my hand in hers and didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't ask why I never came back. She just said, "I knew if you were still alive, you'd find a way to come home." I didn't deserve her forgiveness. I hadn't earned her grace, but she gave it anyway, without condition. That day, under the trembling branches of the park, she brought me back from exile, not by words, but by presence. The boy, her grandson, sat nearby, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Eventually, he wandered over and asked if I'd ever been in the military. Clara smiled at me, then back at him and said, "Yes, a different kind of military." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years, the kind of laugh that cracks through scar tissue. The three of us walked together after that. She invited me for dinner, just like before, back when her porch light was the only thing guiding me through all that grey. Her apartment wasn't far, a small place in the West Village, filled with books, old photographs, and the smell of rosemary and lavender. The walls were pale yellow, the floors creaked with every step. I sat on a real couch for the first time in years, drank tea from a real cup, and slept that night under a real roof. That first night, she brought out the blue handkerchief, the same one, still folded, still waiting. and next to it the insignia. She said, "Now they're both back where they belong." Her grandson asked me questions that night. Endless, honest questions. Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? Why did you live on the street? Were you a spy? I answered what I could carefully. I didn't glamorize, I didn't lie. I told him I used to be someone who watched the world quietly until I forgot how to be part of it. Clara told him he came back because you reminded him of who he was. That boy, who couldn't have known the weight of the past he stumbled into, became the bridge between who I had been and who I still had the chance to become. Today, I still don't exist in any official capacity. My name isn't listed in government databases. I don't appear in any military archive, and if someone were to search for my record, they'd come up empty-handed, just as they always did. There's no pension, no thank you letter, no folded flag sitting in a drawer somewhere. The country I served in silence never acknowledged me, and maybe it never will. But for the first time in my life, I no longer need the system to validate my story, because I have something far more enduring than paper. I have memory, I have presence, and I have a witness. The boy, Clara's grandson, still calls me War Grandpa. He does it with a grin, sometimes teasing, sometimes serious, but always with a certain reverence, like he understands that my silence held weight, even if he doesn't yet grasp its full measure. He's the only person who's ever asked to hear my stories without needing to see proof. We sit at Clara's kitchen table most afternoons now, and he listens, really listens. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open, like he's afraid to interrupt the past as it slips out between sips of tea and pauses between paragraphs. Clara framed the insignia. It now hangs above the bookshelf in her living room, nestled between a family photo from the 70s and an old cross-stitched quote her mother made. Next to it, there's a photograph she found in a drawer, one I didn't know existed. It's us, Clara and me, back in that small Vermont town, standing just outside her porch. I'm younger, clean-shaven, stiff in my posture, and she's holding a jar of preserves and laughing like the world wasn't burning quietly in the background. That photo shouldn't exist. Cameras weren't part of my life back then. But there it is, evidence of a moment I thought had only lived in memory. She found it, she kept it, and now, every time I walk past it, I remember that even in lives built on secrecy, some moments slip through and remain. I still walk through Washington Square Park sometimes. The same bench is there, though the wood is newer now, the paint freshened, the pigeons just as persistent as they were back then. I sit there not as a drifter, not as a man trying to disappear, but as someone who found his way back, without permission, without fanfare, but with truth. When I look around, I see people rushing through life with headphones in, phones out, heads down, and I think, how many stories like mine pass them by unnoticed every day? I used to believe that stories like mine didn't matter if they weren't recorded, if they didn't have dates or signatures or files to prove them. But I've learned that the most important truths are often the ones whispered between generations, passed hand to hand like a metal insignia too small to hold the weight of a life, but powerful enough to carry everything it meant. Clara doesn't ask questions about the years I disappeared. She never demanded explanations, never forced me to relive what I wasn't ready to say. She just let me be, and in doing so, gave me a space to return not just to her, but to myself. That kind of forgiveness can't be earned. It can only be received, and I carry it with me every day now. Maybe I'll never be part of the history books. Maybe no one will ever teach my name in a classroom, or place a marker where I once stood. But every time that boy draws a picture of me, of the coat, of the bench, of the blue handkerchief, and the framed insignia, I know I've been seen. I know my story is alive, and that's enough. We release new stories every day. Real voices, real history. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more.